mind-focused by his impending execution and a 6-month abstinence from recreational drugs, Reich Marshal Hermann Goering told Allied officers at Nuremberg that he knew the war was lost the day he saw American fighters over Berlin. In fact, his reaction to the first US fighter aircraft over Germany had been one of disbelief, and his actions at the time highlighted his blustering incompetence. In September 1943, he received reports that several P-47 Thunderbolts had been brought down over Aachen. These were harbingers of doom. American daylight bomber raids would include increasing numbers of fighter escorts. But Goering dismissed the news, saying they were short-range fighters blown off course by the wind. Incredibly, the Luftwaffe was compelled to accept their commander's judgment until 1944, by which time the air defense of the Reich was close to collapse. Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, Chief of RAF Bomber Command, made a characteristically blunt statement during a wartime newsreel. The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else, and nobody was going to bomb them. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and half a hundred other places, they put that rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they're going to reap the whirlwind. The combined bomber offensive, as the British and American aerial campaign was called, led to the devastation of most German cities. A total of 1.42 million tons of bombs was dropped on Germany, effectively destroying all industry by the beginning of 1945. The defeat of Germany's aerial defenses led directly to the loss of the war. Like most major powers in the 1930s, Germany had developed a civil and military system to protect itself against air attack. Some 12 million German civilians had undergone limited training in civil defense. Pride of place in the defensive network were 2,600 anti-aircraft guns, more than any other nation. Germany had one of the most effective air defense systems in the world in place at the outbreak of war. 800,000 men, 2/3 of the Luftwaffe strength, were assigned to the Flak arm, and by 1944, this had risen to 1.25 million. Flak is an abbreviation of Fliegerabwehrkanonen, or anti-aircraft artillery, and it was used in two main ways. Heavy fixed batteries were used to protect the German homeland and major Luftwaffe bases, while lighter mobile units provided armies in the field with anti-aircraft cover. There was a chain of radar stations looking out across the North Sea, but unlike its British equivalent, there was no central command authority to coordinate the defending aircraft on the basis of the radar reports. German defenses were essentially local. Two special zones were created for the defense of the vital Ruhr industries and for Berlin itself. Only a handful of fighter aircraft were involved in the air defense of Germany. In 1939 and 1940, the defenses were good enough to allow Luftwaffe fighters to intercept daylight raids by RAF twin-engine bombers. British fighters were too short-ranged to reach Germany, and the unescorted bombers' defensive armament was too weak to protect them. The Germans inflicted prohibitive losses, which forced RAF Bomber Command to switch to night bombing. But this was largely ineffective. A 1941 report exposed the embarrassing fact that less than 1/10 of British bombs fell within 3 miles of their targets. The revelation provided further stimulus to those officers who favored the indiscriminate bombing of major urban centers. Churchill himself stated that an attack on German civilian morale was a worthwhile objective. The defeat of the daylight attacks and the relatively small scale of early British raids gave the Germans a false sense of security. Little was done to modernize their defenses. Indeed, once Western Europe was overrun, German military production was cut back. It was not increased again until the invasion of Russia stalled in the snow outside Moscow at the end of 1941. Research on radar was cancelled on Hitler's orders in 1940, and when it resumed, it was conducted by Luftwaffe staff alone. In Britain, radar was one of the first projects tackled by the civilian scientific community, and the Western Allies established an early technological lead. Germany's greatest successes in the later night battles came not from their own airborne radar sets, but by developing devices that homed in on British radar emissions. Hitler regarded aircraft as flying artillery to support the army in battle by bombing targets close to the front lines. These included road and rail junctions, artillery batteries, and tank concentrations. He had no interest in strategic bombing as understood by the Allies. Characteristically, he put more value on the use of bombers against civilian targets, acting purely as an instrument of terror. He put his ideas into practice at Rotterdam, during the London Blitz, and in the attack on Belgrade, which opened the German invasion of Yugoslavia. RAF Bomber Command famously bombed Berlin itself during the Battle of Britain. These small raids triggered Hitler's retaliatory attacks on London, which gave RAF Fighter Command a vital breathing space. Yet the RAF bombing raids were no more than pinpricks, having little effect on the German economy. As British analysis revealed in August 1941, on a typical raid, less than a third of bombers got within 5 miles of their targets. Over the smog-shrouded Ruhr, the figure was only 1 in 10. Like most Germans, Adolf Hitler concluded the British terror bombers had resorted to the indiscriminate bombing of civilian population centres, when in fact they simply could not find their targets. With the occupation of Western Europe, German defences were expanded. Under the command of General Joseph Kammhuber, a new radar network extended from the French coast, through Germany and north into Denmark. Since British bombers attacked individually, making their own way to and from their targets, the defences were structured accordingly. The Kammhuber line consisted of a chain of Würzburg radar sets, each of which could scan an area approximately 30 kilometers square. As a bomber entered its zone, the radar directed an interception by a modified Bf-110 twin-engine fighter. Additionally, dedicated units of searchlights and anti-aircraft guns were deployed around major cities. Kammhuber's defensive system worked well until mid-1942. Bomber Command's casualties were proportionally very high, with less than half its aircrew likely to survive their first tour of operations. But the Germans failed to appreciate that since 1940, the British had devoted considerable energy to the development of a vastly more capable strategic bombing force. The Royal Air Force was expanding its airfields, stepping up personnel recruitment, and training ground staff in very large numbers. Above all, the British aircraft industry had accelerated the development and production of a series of large, new 4-engine bombers. It was a long-term investment, but it forged a potentially war-winning weapon. Once the new aircraft entered production and aircrew completed their training, Air Marshal Harris was able to swamp the Kammhuber line, concentrating his bombing raids in both time and space. Germany had scant resources to direct on this new threat. The Luftwaffe was fully committed in the east. German aircraft played a key role in stopping the Red Army's offensive early in 1942, and then were used to support the German army across the whole front that summer. The siege of Sevastopol was ably assisted by Fliegerkorps 8, which made use of a high proportion of the Luftwaffe's bombers. When the 1942 advance on the Caucasus faltered and a massive Russian counterattack surrounded the Sixth Army, the Luftwaffe threw in everything into its doomed attempt to supply Stalingrad from the air. Every available pilot was used, including test pilots and flying instructors. With the Wehrmacht surge eastwards thwarted, the German High Command decided on a major offensive in July 1943 to eliminate the large Soviet salient around Kursk. By mid-1943, the Soviet Air Force had been re-equipped with modern, capable combat aircraft. For the first time, the Soviets fielded fighters to match the best the Luftwaffe could offer. At low and medium altitudes, the new Yaks and Lavochkins could dogfight at least as well as their German opponents. In keeping with Soviet philosophy, all of these new designs were tough, easy to build, and easy to fly. They could operate in harsh climates and fly home with extensive battle damage. Together, these fighters turned the air war in Russia. Their impact was decisive on the ground as well. The great German offensive at Kursk in the summer of 1943, after some initial success, was stopped by a massive coordinated Russian ground and air counterattack. Kursk is known as the greatest, most ferocious armored battle in history, but it was also one of the biggest air battles ever fought. It cost the Luftwaffe dearly in aircraft and trained aircrew, who would be desperately needed over the Reich in the coming months. The summer of 1943 was a critical point in the air war. Following the first US Army Air Force raids in 1942, the Americans were now over Europe in strength. Starved of resources, the German defenses nevertheless gave a good account of themselves against the inexperienced Americans. At first, Luftwaffe Chief of Staff Hans Jeschonek welcomed the arrival of the heavy bombers. In a lecture he gave in 1942, he claimed that every one the Allies built made him happy. For, he said, "We will bring down the 4-engine bombers just like we brought down the twin-engine bombers." Belatedly, the Germans recognized that the US daylight bomber campaign was not a temporary phenomenon. The Allied combined bomber offensive confronted Germany with a serious problem. It was more than terror bombing. It was a deliberate strategy to systematically tear the heart out of German industry. The Americans were bullish and initially overestimated their capabilities. They flew their heavily armed B-17, B-24 bombers in daylight deep into Germany without fighter cover. Although they were huge targets, the bombers flew in close formations for self-defense. An attacking fighter could be engaged by a frightening number of heavy machine guns. But if a bomber detached from the formation, it could be destroyed with far less risk to the fighters. This was formally recognized by the German scoring system that charted a pilot's progress towards the highest gallantry awards. The destruction of a 4-engine bomber was worth 3 points, but to separate one from the formation was still worth 2. Shooting down an enemy fighter was worth 1 point. 20 points earned a flyer the German Cross in gold. 40 points garnered a Knight's Cross. Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer discovered that the best method of attacking the US bomber formations was from directly ahead and slightly above. Few of the bombers' guns pointed forward, and a burst into the cockpit was the surest way to bring them down. However, the closing speeds were terrifying. A fighter had at best 1 second in which to shoot before he had to break away or collide with his target. The US Army Air Force eventually added a chin turret to their B-17s, but Meyer's tactic remained in use until the end of the war. Some Focke-Wulf FW-190s were fitted with up to 6 20mm cannon, giving them every chance of destroying a bomber in a single pass. But the upgunned fighter was sluggish and less agile, and required its own escorts as protection from Allied single-seaters. The R-4M unguided air-to-air rockets involved a similar trade-off between firepower and performance. Regardless of weapon fit or fighter type, a minority of pilots accounted for a large proportion of kills. At least 15 ex-Spartan shot down over 20 U.S. Army Air Force 4-engine bombers each, with 3 destroying more than 30. But this was still to come. In the summer of 1943, American commanders were convinced that their bombers could fight through, bombing key economic targets with deadly accuracy. Operation Juggler was conceived to cripple the Nazi ball-bearing industry at Schweinfurt. The plan's success depended upon the German defenses being decoyed by a heavy raid escorted by fighters on Regensburg. By attracting the German fighters, this would allow a second wave of American bombers to reach Schweinfurt virtually unopposed. Unfortunately, the American planners had not allowed for the vagaries of British weather. On the day of the operation, the 17th of August 1943, fog blanketed the airfields of both bomber formations. The Regensburg group managed to take off, but the Schweinfurt raiders were delayed for 3.5 hours. By the time they crossed the occupied coast, the German day fighters, fresh from their successes against the Regensburg bombers, had refueled and were waiting. The first group of 60 B-17s was intercepted by the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader JG-26, with elements of JG-2, JG-3 and JG-5. 21 bombers had been lost before they reached their target, with a further 7 compelled to return home with a full payload. 183 bombers did manage to attack the target, but 36 were lost, and a further 19 returned too heavily damaged for future missions. The raids did have some effect. Ball-bearing production dropped by 21%, but within 3 weeks, Albert Speer had restored it to pre-raid levels. Tellingly, no American crews were awarded distinguished unit citations for the action. The Germans enjoyed a brief respite after a repeat raid in October was punished with similar unsustainable casualties. Some optimists even believed that they had permanently driven the Americans, as the British before them, into the night skies. That complacency was fatal, since the United States 8th Air Force was only the tip of an industrial juggernaut. U.S. investment in aircraft manufacture was on a scale that dwarfed that of all other belligerent nations. Luftwaffe intelligence estimates suggested that the Americans would produce some 16,000 machines in 1942. Actual production totals were 47,000. In the first 8 months of 1944, the 8th Air Force quadrupled in size. And the British were also becoming a formidable foe. Whereas the German heavy bomber program had been cancelled on the eve of the war, the British persevered. From 1942, Halifax and Lancaster 4-engine bombers replaced the earlier types. Flying higher and with heavier payloads, they inflicted considerably more damage. With the introduction of aluminized explosive in 1944, the effects were even greater. The night campaign intensified during 1943, as Bomber Command introduced new navigational aids and airborne radar systems that improved accuracy. Hamburg, easy to locate with the new technology, and Tinder dry after hot summer weather, were subjected to a particularly horrific attack. In a coordinated series of raids in July 1943, the defending fighters and flak were paralyzed by the use of an anti-radar device known as Window. On the ground, incendiaries created a firestorm that destroyed the center of the city, killing as many as 40,000 people. The German Weapons Research Station at Peenemünde was also subjected to heavy attack, fatally delaying the V-1 flying bomb program and driving Hans Jeschonek to commit suicide. Popular opinion turned against the Luftwaffe for failing to defend Germany. Party officials joined the army and navy in heaping abuse on the once favored elite. In his perverse way, Hitler welcomed the Allied bombing attacks. "The devastation actually works in our favor," he told his inner circle, "because it is creating a body of people with nothing to lose, people who will therefore fight on with utter fanaticism. Characteristically, Hitler's reaction to the Allied bomber offensive was not to strengthen Germany's defenses, but to bomb Britain. In his own mind, he was meeting terror with terror. However, the biggest raid the Luftwaffe was able to launch included only 150 twin-engine bombers, small beer compared to the British 1,000 bomber raids. But bombers were no longer Germany's only countermeasure. Hitler was putting tremendous faith in his revenge weapons. The V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistic missile absorbed colossal industrial capacity, resources that might have been better devoted to protecting Germany. Although Goering still did not believe in the bomber threat, there was a more realistic appreciation at operational levels. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected fighter aces, had been made General der Jagdflieger at the end of 1941. His first success had been in arranging the cover for Operation Cerberus in 1942, when the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau broke through the English Channel from Brest. Galland knew that priority must be given to the newest threat, the American escort fighters, which would soon be appearing in increasing numbers over the Reich. Although more and more German fighters were transferred to the west, together with increasing quantities of anti-aircraft guns and searchlights, it was a haphazard process, frustrated by overlapping army, Nazi party and Luftwaffe responsibilities. Galland, backed by Feldmarschall Erhard Milch, warned of a coming onslaught in 1944, and that the Luftwaffe would need 3 or 4 times as many interceptors as the Americans had escorting fighters. Yet German aircraft production remained sluggish and wasteful of resources. Factories remained on single shift, while those in Britain, America and Russia worked around the clock. The organization of fighter forces was not centrally coordinated. Available machines were divided between Germany and occupied Europe. Not until the autumn of 1943, with the establishment of Luftflotte Reich, were the night fighters and day fighter formations brought under control of the same headquarters. Hitler favored flak over fighters. The famous 88mm gun was one of his favorite weapons, and German anti-aircraft batteries did receive large quantities of new weapons. By late 1943, there were 9 flak divisions and 7 independent flak brigades across Germany, the Low Countries, and northern France. They were equipped with 50,000 anti-aircraft guns, including 14,000 88s and 2,000 of the even larger 105mm weapons. They were supported by gunnery control radar units and searchlight batteries. But the gun and searchlight batteries soaked up manpower urgently needed on the fighting fronts, and crews increasingly came to consist of youths, prisoners of war from Eastern Europe, and women, leavened by regular troops invalided out of the frontline units in Russia. So many RAF bombers returned with shrapnel damage. The British believed flak to be their most deadly enemy. In the increasingly crowded skies over Germany, many crews witnessed the hideous sight of a bomber caught by searchlights and its desperate attempts to escape the shells detonating around it. Airmen began to tell stories of a special shell that blew up with terrible force, destroying aircraft with a single blast. Many claimed to have seen it in use. But what they probably saw was the catastrophic result of a fully loaded heavy bomber exploding after a direct hit. German anti-aircraft guns fired conventional time-fused shells intended to explode in the path of the bombers. They certainly had some effect, but at considerable cost. Each direct hit on a bomber at altitude required an average of 16,000 rounds from the 88mm Flak 36, or 8,000 from the improved Flak 41 model. The most effective German weapon was the fighter. Despite the modest numbers of machines employed, night fighters accounted for 2/3 of British losses. Hitler took heart from the defeat of RAF Bomber Command's Battle of Berlin, a prolonged series of raids against the German capital during the winter of 1943-44. An attack on Nuremberg in March 1944 cost the British 95 4-engine bombers. In one night, Bomber Command lost more aircrew than Fighter Command did in the Battle of Britain. Such was Allied material superiority, however, that even these high losses were easily absorbed. Both the British and the Americans had continued to expand their bomber fleets, and now the bombers came with added protection. Escort fighters were the only effective daylight counter to the Luftwaffe. Early American raids were escorted by Spitfires, but they lacked the range to go all the way. The first American fighter in Europe was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Although no match for a Messerschmitt in a dogfight, it was fast and could outdive any German fighter. It could also take an immense amount of punishment. Early P-47s also lacked range. But by the second half of 1943, the introduction of drop tanks and the development of long-distance flying techniques allowed the Americans to gradually increase the fighter's range. By the late summer of 1943, they were increasingly effective against German fighters. The twin-boom P-38 Lightning also arrived in the summer of 1943. This had the range and speed to escort bombers over Germany, but it needed an exceptional pilot to get the better of an ME-109 or a FW-190. Without a doubt, the most dramatic debut of the war was that of the North American P-51 Mustang. Incorporating a supremely efficient airframe with a classic Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang had a range and performance which astounded friend and foe alike. With external tanks, the Mustang could fly to Berlin, fight at full power for more than 20 minutes, and return to England. It was faster than the 109 and 190, could dive and climb faster, and was at least as good in a dogfight. With escort all the way to and from their targets, from their little friends, the bombers were able to carry out their principal aim, destruction of the German war machine. Although the German aces were still the world's finest fighter pilots, Allied flyers reported a steady drop in the average quality of their opponents. British and American pilots went into battle only after extensive training. But as pressure on manpower and resources grew, the new Luftwaffe pilots were flung into action with less and less preparation. During 1944, many of the Experten ran out of luck. Men like Walter Nowotny, considered by many to have been the best fighter pilot of all time. Fifth-ranking Luftwaffe fighter ace, he was officially credited with 258 kills. He flew with JG-54 during the invasion of the USSR and scored his first victory on the 23rd of July 1941. He reached 100 kills on the 17th of July 1943 and then accelerated the pace. By the 18th of August, he had added another 50 kills. By the 22nd of September, his score had risen to 220, and on the 19th of October, he was the first pilot in history to reach 250 kills, the remarkable total coming in only 442 combat missions, with the last 150 being scored in only 3 months. In August 1944, he took command of the 1st Combat Jet Fighter Unit, renamed Commando Nowotny in October 1944. It lost its commander on the 8th of November when his Me-262 lost power. Nursing his jet back to the runway on only one engine, he was caught by a Mustang. Nowotny bailed out, but his parachute snagged the tailplane and he was dragged down to his death. Attrition was thinning out the night fighter Experten as well. Oberstleutnant Helmut Lent, the first man to achieve 100 kills by night and the most influential combat leader in his field, did not see out the year. On a flight to see a friend in October 1944, an engine failed just before landing and his Me-110 crashed. The badly injured ace died 4 days later. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet counteroffensive was gaining momentum. In March 1944, the Jagdverband could field a daily average of 330 fighters along the entire 3,000-kilometer front. With this, They were expected to protect the retreating German army from around 3,000 Soviet aircraft, of which roughly half were frontline Yaks and Lavochkins. Astonishingly, the Luftwaffe was able to display its traditional skill and fight back. By March 1944, 2 fighter wings, JG-51 and JG-54, had each shot down a total of 7,000 enemy aircraft. In 1944, the US Army Air Force made the defeat of the Luftwaffe its top priority. The invasion of Europe and the daylight bombing of Germany could not proceed until this was achieved. Operation Argument, or Big Week, was a concentrated series of raids designed to destroy the German fighter arm in the air and on the ground, and to smash Germany's aircraft industry. A continuous series of day and night raids was launched on the 19th of February, 1944. The Luftwaffe was hard hit. More than 300 fighters were destroyed, and with them, many irreplaceable pilots. But the cost to the Allies was equally severe. The Americans lost 226 heavy bombers, and the British lost 122. And the damage done to the German aircraft industry was less than had been hoped. By this time, Armaments Minister Albert Speer had already started dispersing key factories underground. Allied attacks on Germany diminished as raids on France were mounted in preparation for the D-Day landings. Confident that Germany's defenses had beaten off the attackers, Hitler transferred 200,000 Luftwaffe personnel to the army on the Russian front. The Normandy landings opened up another European front, and the Luftwaffe found itself in combat in the east, the west, and in Italy. When the combined bomber offensive resumed in full force, the Luftwaffe was hopelessly outnumbered. Its daylight fighter strength was no more than that of RAF Fighter Command in 1940. The D-Day landings involved some 12,000 Allied aircraft, and only 300 German machines were available to oppose them. Over the next months, more than 1,000 German fighters were sent to the invasion front, fighters that were urgently needed for the defense of the Reich itself. In the face of near total Allied superiority, most of the barely trained pilots could do little but die bravely. As the German army was forced back within the boundaries of the Reich, the ferocity of the air fighting increased, with German fighter pilots struggling to defend their homeland. The latest developments of the Me-109 and FW-190, with their increasingly heavy armament, took a serious toll of Allied bombers. To these were added the threat from newly developed jet and rocket-powered fighters. These measures proved to be too little, too late. With each bomber raid, the Allies squeezed the Luftwaffe a little harder. Faced with a mounting fuel shortage, every pilot able to fly was needed. Luftwaffe losses soared. Each month, Germany lost more than half its operational fighters and a quarter of its pilots. Training was curtailed by fuel shortages and the desperate need to replace casualties. By the last year of the war, German pilots received only a third as much training time as their opponents. The sudden collapse of Germany's air defenses came as a hideous surprise to Hitler and Goering, who had ignored the warnings of Galland and Milk for so long. Hitler reached for technological solutions, jet and rocket fighters, air-to-air rockets, and the first surface-to-air missiles. The Luftwaffe became the first air force in the world to operate jet fighters in combat, but technology could not compensate for numerical inferiority. Rushed into service, the Messerschmitt's engines had an average life of 10 hours. They were unreliable, vulnerable to flame-out, and the loss of one engine usually triggered a fatal spin. Even with these handicaps, 22 Me-262 pilots became jet aces. Oberst Heinz Baer's 16 kills have yet to be surpassed by any jet flyer. Lacking effective jets of their own, the Allies ambushed the Me-262s near their bases. With half of all Me-262 losses occurring in this way, Luftwaffe pilots had to slip back to their airfields as close to the deck as they dared. Knight's Cross Height, as it became known. Total war meant that non-combatants suffered as never before in human history. During the Second World War, British civilian losses amounted to more than 65,000 killed. Between them, the British and American air forces lost over 20,000 planes and 102,000 personnel. But civilian losses in the German Reich in this period reached a staggering 609,000 killed, with another million wounded. Over 3 million homes were destroyed. RAF Bomber Command had set out to destroy German morale by its prolonged attacks on civilian and industrial targets alike. From January 1943, the Americans came by day and the RAF by night. However, as with the London Blitz, the desired psychological impact was never attained. It can be argued that the results were counterproductive, lending credence to Nazi propaganda and blunting internal resistance against Hitler. There was no inevitability about the defeat of the Luftwaffe in the long campaign over the Reich. When British bombers had started their campaign in 1940, they were merely engaged on a morale-boosting exercise for the embattled British. Churchill had ordered up whatever resources the RAF could scratch together. By day and night, the RAF were knocked out of the skies. The night fighter arm, with some 700 planes, inflicted such losses upon the RAF that for a time the night offensive was suspended. But far more important was the failure to stop the US Army Air Force daylight raids. When they had operated without fighter protection, their losses had been horrifying, as high as 26% on the second Schweinfurt raid. But the Luftwaffe was to be driven from the skies by the Mustang. Germany's defenders were being cut down before they could even reach the bomber fleet. It was this fighter, more than any other, which allowed the daylight offensive to continue. Heavily outnumbered, the Luftwaffe pilots put up a brave fight. The events of early 1944 seemed to show that if they had been given enough aircraft, then defeat could have been avoided. Despite fighter protection, the Allied bombers continued to endure large losses. But the German loss rate was increasing. The Berlin raid on the 6th of March 1944 saw 80 Allied aircraft shot down, but the Luftwaffe lost the same number of fighters. Germany could not win in a war of attrition. From May 1944, the US Army Air Force concentrated on German oil production. This was the final blow to the Air Force. Even the successful night fighters, starved of fuel, could not get airborne in sufficient quantities, and the British flew more heavy night raids. Milk had promised Goering that the vital armaments and oil industries, and thus the Reich, could be adequately defended by day fighters just as long as they outnumbered the enemy by 4-1. But Hitler and the Reich Marshal refused to listen. The impact of Speer's greatly increased fighter production was squandered by siphoning off aircraft to meet ground attack demands on other fronts. Eyes fixed for too long on new conquests, Hitler neglected the defense of the Reich until too late. He himself was driven underground 3 months before the Russians overran his bunker. As the Allies advanced across northern Europe and the Soviet armies fought their way through the streets of Berlin in May 1945, the once vaunted Luftwaffe had been reduced to impotence. Without fuel, its surviving pilots could only watch from the ground as Allied fighters celebrated over the ruins of the Reich.